So we're here at the 54th session on the Commission on the Status of Women. This year the Commission marks 15 years since the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action. And many NGOs are organizing events around themes drawn from the Beijing Platform for Action. And one of the issues that we've been exploring is the question of the portrayal of women and girls in the media. Also, this is an issue that was raised by the Beijing Platform for Action and something that many NGOs have been working on. We have with us today Professor Michael Karlberg from the University of Western Washington. He's a professor of communications there and was also one of the speakers on a panel that was held in our office yesterday. The title of the panel was Portrayal or Betrayal, also looking at the portrayal of women and girls in the media. So we wanted to talk with him a little bit further, delve a little bit deeper into the issues that were raised by him and during the panel in general. So thank you for being with us today. First question is, in your view, what are some of the impacts of mass media on girls and women?
Well, it's a complicated question because media impacts, of course, are very difficult to measure. But there's a growing body of empirical evidence that there are quite a few impacts on girls and women associated with both physical health and performance, mental health, as well as opportunities and discrimination in the workplace and around society. That media can be an important contributing factor to many of those challenges that women face in today's society, although clearly it's not a sole factor. But it can make a fairly profound contribution in many of these areas for many women. So, for instance, probably one of the best studies on this was done by the American Psychological Association in 2007. Mm-hmm. They commissioned a task force to look specifically at the sexualization of girls in media. And this task force reviewed many other, virtually all other sort of relevant studies that had been done to date on the sexualization of girls. And they concluded, based on that, that as a result of the massive exposure to highly sexualized commercial media content in our society, that girls suffer a number of challenges related to both their physical, mental health, and performance, their achievements, and so forth. And one of the phrases that stands out from that APA task force study is that the media not only objectify girls and women in a sexual way, but that actually cultivate a position of self-objectification, mm-hmm. so that girls grow up in this media environment begin to perceive themselves as objects, and that this results, among other things, in what they call the fragmentation of their consciousness. So I think that's a phrase that helps capture some of the concern we should have about the way girls and women are portrayed in media and the way it impacts them. I will say there are skeptics, there are people who debate, the impact of media on women, just as there were skeptics and people who tried to refute, the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, neither of which actually can be proven empirically. We can find correlations, and we can try and interpret those through various theories, and an emerging consensus in the area of media studies and media impacts that the APA task force arrived at, certainly, is that there are profound and very troubling impacts on women.
I think the term that you used, the fragmented consciousness, I think it's something that we can come back to a little bit later. I think it would be helpful to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But I want to come back to what you're describing as the situation in the media environment, which you spoke of yesterday as a crisis. Could you elaborate a little bit further about the nature of the crisis?
Sure. So, another thing that a lot of people who study media and and think about its impacts on society are concluding is that really we're facing something of a crisis with our media environment. That as a result of a complex set of forces over many generations, our media has been moving in a direction that's increasingly unhealthy, unjust, and unsustainable. And that, you know, it's really not so helpful to look at the media in terms of just like individual messages, but actually to think about the media as an encompassing environment that we live within, we're born within. You know, many people use television as a babysitter for their children. Our school-age children are consuming up to 3 hours of television a day and another 3.5 hours of largely commercial media, non-television media. The average American watches over 4 hours of television alone every day in this country. So if we think about the media as an environment within which we live, which constituted by thousands of images and messages we're exposed to every day, we have cause to be very concerned. And I think really the concern should be similar to the concern we have about our natural environment. Global warming, for instance, it's a significant threat to our well-being, our prosperity, and many people, myself included, would argue that the condition of our media environment today should concern us on that same level, that we need to begin taking this very seriously. We need to begin efforts to reform our media environment, and we need to begin asking the question, how do we create a more healthy, just, and sustainable media environment?
And you talked specifically yesterday about two dimensions of the crisis, that we can look at it from the level of the individual and we can look at its institutional dimensions. Can you talk a bit about those two?
Yeah, so I think it's very helpful to recognize if we want to create a healthier, more just, more sustainable media environment, how do we go about that? Well, I think we need to recognize there are at least two dimensions to the problem, two things that got us here. And if we want to change things, we need to simultaneously address both. And those are, on one hand, the individual dimension, I would say, the role that individual media consumers play in this, and on the other hand, the institutional dimension, the role that institutional forces play in this. Because on one hand, we have clearly much of the media in commercial media markets responds to some degree to individual choices, the media we choose to consume. And in that regard, individuals, if they're making those choices based on, what I would consider to be their sort of basest appetites for sexual titillation and violence and these sorts of things, and the media will give us those that type of content. So individual choice is clearly an important role to play. But then institutional forces have to also be taken into account, because media institutions are not actually just responding to individual choices. They're actually structuring the menu from which we choose. And in that regard, when you set up media as commercial for-profit entities, their goal is to maximize profit and minimize costs. And one of the best ways to produce cheap content that maximizes audiences is with a lot of sexual imagery, a lot of violence and conflict. It's kind of the equivalent of the high salt, high fat, high sugar diet or ingredients in junk food that are highly profitable, that appeal to basic appetites that we've inherited from our animal nature. Those structures, those choices.